mostly lost my voice at this point, so I'm going to talk to you for 45 minutes, and then I'm going to cough and crack the whole time. Like, I'm going to cough right now. You should probably turn off my mic for a second. Did you turn off my mic yet? No? You should turn it off, because I'm going to cough really badly right now. Please turn it off. Yeah. Turn it off. No. None of these things change. I feel like I sent the wrong slides or something. I changed the date on this. Anyway, okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Future of Developer Experience. I felt that title was a little too ambitious, so I kept working title in there to kind of lower the bar for what we're going to be talking about today. So this presentation is kind of an outline to the way I've been thinking about developer experience as a product strategy when our customer is a developer and when we're building tools for our developer customers. So I wanted to start from kind of a first principles approach to how I would work through all of our developer products. And so that's kind of the presentation today. It's going to be very much a framework that I'm now using to drive product strategy when thinking about developer products. This is me. I've introduced myself like 3 times now today, so we will move on. Okay, so the agenda. First, we'll talk about why should we care about developer experience. Then we'll kind of form a definition of developer experience. And then, I don't know, sort of what should we expect from our developer tools? And then what is Sitecore building based on this set of principles? So hopefully we'll get to the fun stuff quicker, if I can talk quickly. So why should we care about developer experience? Well, first and foremost, we're building things for our end users and customers, especially partners building for customers who are ultimately building for their customers. We're thinking about productive developers, efficient, productive developers who can get us to faster time to value for the marketer and the end customer users. But I like to think about the next stage of this is once we move past productivity and just pure efficiency, what can we do when we can develop faster and we can develop quicker the same things? We're not building the same carousel component 50 times. We can get to innovation. Ultimately, I'm sure many of you have seen this in your own partner implementations. We leave all the great innovative work to the end, and then it kind of falls into a nice to have because we're solving the same problems over and over again. And then ultimately for a company like Sitecore, you get to this other stage, which is if developers love the tools they're working with, they become advocates for those brands and for those tools. And so we have a vested interest at Sitecore in you having a great developer experience with our tools. So let's kind of set a stage for what is developer experience and how we're going to define it. So in the most simple sense, user experience for developers, but with developers you have a ton more interfaces, right? So you have your UIs, but you have CLIs and APIs and SDKs, but user experience kind of goes beyond just the products itself. For developers, we're talking about docs. We're talking about the content that's created around the tools we use, and then we're also talking about the community that we can lean on when something goes wrong, and then the questions that we can ask, the Stack Overflow pages and the Discord channels and the Slack channels where we can get information from other people using the same tools as us. So I want to approach this more holistic view of what developer experience is from the product out. So I'm using this framework that Sean Wang, who was a DevRel at Netlify, he's a really interesting thinker in this space, kind of put together for this idea of the end-to-end developer experience. So I took a framework that he kind of suggested, and I did this for XM Cloud. So I started to think, like, if we want to think about this end-to-end developer experience from product to docs to content to community, like, can we do an audit of everything that makes up XM Cloud in terms of its developer experience? So what are all those UIs and SDKs and the places in which the developer is the focus of the product that we're building? And then an audit of our own internal docs, and then an audit of content. And some of that content is generated by us, Sitecore, and some of it's generated by the community. And content has that interesting bridge of, like, great content is also content that's coming from MVP blogs and from the greater community. And then the true kind of community channel, the Slack and the Discords, but also the meetups and the SUGCON presentations. And so if we think about this end-to-end developer experience and always try to account for it in the work that we do, I think we get to kind of an interesting way of planning for building products. Cool. So now here's this other area that was a really interesting exercise for me, which was taking all of the tools and all of the tasks that are involved in building with XM Cloud and orienting them in a kind of matrix. So I ended up landing on these two distinct axes for what the XM Cloud product space is. So for developers, we care about happy and unhappy paths, right? Like, we're going to fail on our builds. We're going to fail all the time. We're going to have bugs, and we're going to have to troubleshoot them. And so a good developer experience is accounting just as much for what happens when things are unhappy as these kind of happy paths, the quick demo, the look, I got everything started in 5 minutes. But and we'll kind of go into this a bit more. Like, a good quality developer experience is one that privileges the unhappy path over the happy path, because the unhappy path is where your tools are going to be really challenging for you. But then I think this vertical axis for me became really important to quantifying development within XM Cloud and potentially within Sitecore as well, which is there's front-end development, like head application development, building all the websites that are these final experiences for your customers. And then there's authoring extensibility. So this division is kind of driving a lot of my thinking right now with regards to how we're planning for developer tooling in XM Cloud. Is authoring extensibility is all those areas where you're doing things on the CM instance. You're integrating with translation services and third-party DAM libraries and doing, kind of custom content resolution, writing to the CM. And with that division, it sort of helped put a framework on how I'm going to think about dev tooling. So, and so I kind of landed here in a more simplified view once I've thought about the different products that your happy paths for head application development is onboarding and ongoing website development. The happy path is building integrations and custom content resolution for authoring. But then you always kind of land in the area of having good, observable, monitored systems the moment something goes wrong. So thus you kind of land on this idea of the radiating circles of developer experience. And again, this is not my idea, I just kind of use this framework where we now think about any product we build. Okay, if it's a head application, are we accounting for the happy and the unhappy paths? Are we building it into our product, but also into our docs and our content and our community, ways to solve and think around these products? So one last thing to talk about with developer experience, a bit more of the analytics. Microsoft and GitHub published a paper, I think this is in 2023 at this point, about these 3 key metrics that they've found for quantifying, a good developer experience. And so they land in this notion of feedback loops, where you get a quick response when something goes wrong, so that you know as you're developing that you have a fast build time, so you can see the build quickly and keep going back to work. The longer the feedback loop is, the more space there is for us to lose our attention, but the more space there is for us to lose understanding of what went wrong. So quick responses mean less technical debt, and it also means more innovation. If you're not fighting so much to get information back, you can kind of start to think more innovatively. So what does that translate into? It means like good error messaging, fast build times, links to docs in place, and like just really good observable systems. Second one is cognitive ease. So this is that the tools you're using are intuitive, the code is understandable, the deployments are easy, that we're using industry common best practices, and that you're able to reason about what's happening in your system. There's no magic happening that you have a hard time kind of wrapping your head around. And there's this big sort of psychological proof that cognitive ease, like less stress and more reasonable understanding, actually leads to more creativity. The human brain just needs ease in order to like have the space to be creative. And then the third is flow state, right? Like we all know once we get developing and we're like heads down focused, we can get into a flow that can be wildly productive. And so how do you create experiences in which you have that time to not be interrupted or disrupted from your flow? The fundamental thing here is limit context switching. If I'm working in code, I don't want to have to go into a UI to configure something, because that switching back and forth between context oftentimes like disrupts flow. So these are kind of the key metrics in which we're going to define the work we're doing in product development and make sure that the products that we're building like focus to be cognitively easy, promote good flow state, and have good feedback loops. So be remiss in 2024 not to talk about AI. This stat came out last year that 56% of professional developers are using GitHub Copilot. Like ultimately, AI within the development space is already here. We're already using assistive technologies all the time in the work that we're doing. There's been further studies that have shown that it's like greatly improved the productivity of more senior developers and oftentimes exaggerates the problems of a junior developer. But ultimately, like we're all using AI in our work every day. So if we start thinking about AI-augmented development and like what AI is going to bring into developer experience, we think about co-pilots and generative UI, design to code. Like we're seeing all these tools coming out to output from prompts, visual components. We're looking at like framework to framework conversion. That's really straightforward. But so when it comes to product design and development, I've been thinking a lot about the techniques that we need to use to support AI. We need to be able to store context information that we can feed into a RAG model the way Rob was showing yesterday. Because of context, we need to think about encapsulation as sort of a more important paradigm than separation of concerns. So, ultimately the MPC model and things in which, there's context spread across multiple files in order to have a separation of concern. It's a pattern that is a bit more challenging for AI than like having a fully encapsulated, modular experience. And I've been thinking about schema validation, mapping functions, like the importance of unit and end-to-end testing when you introduce AI into a space. And then ultimately, streaming is also a really important concept, right? Like LLMs take a long time to output their final product, and so having more streaming in our web experiences, brought to the marketer is going to allow us to not slow down our web applications in order to utilize AI in more and more interesting ways. So next step, what should we expect from our developer tools? So this has sort of all brought me to this DevEx principles for product development. So these are the kind of guiding principles that I'm proposing as a framework for how we develop DevEx tools within Sitecore. And so they are: all user experience product rules apply. There's nothing different about building a developer tool for a developer than there is building a customer-focused tool for a user who's going to use a UI. Like, ultimately, all product management rules still apply. And so then I land on design for simplicity and design for exceptions. And then we want to, at all times, try to reduce the feature learning curve. Any new feature we introduce, I want to set some expectations around the time in which it takes to learn and to master that feature. And then I want to evaluate all the features by those DevEx metrics that we just went over: cognitive ease, feedback loops, and flow state. So all user experience product rules still apply. Understand your users, empathize with their problems, map their entire user journey, and conduct user research. Baby's perspective, client's perspective. Design for simplicity. So I like this quote very much. The general problem with ambitious systems is complexity. It is important to emphasize the value of simplicity and elegance, for complexity has a way of compounding difficulties. I think we can all appreciate that with very big enterprise systems. They have a tendency to compound difficulties. So what does design for simplicity mean? So to me, in terms of how we're going to use this in our product development principles, simple names, explicit, concise, simple patterns that are reasonable, that are not so complex it's hard to understand. Simple exits. If you don't like our opinions, is it easy for you to get out of them and do your own thing? Simple debugging experiences. And just as a core thing, like, good DevEx should never be at the expense of good UX. Like, we don't, something that is a really good dev tool but slows down the end web application, like, we can't lose the focus of the end user experience. And then two things just to emphasize, like magic and black boxes, they aren't simple. They're merely hiding the complexity in a way that makes it harder for us to kind of understand and reason about them. So every time I hear people talking about things that are really magical, from a developer perspective, that's great until something goes wrong. And then I have no way about how to reason about what's actually happening under the hood because it's a bit too complex. And AI, when you're really working with it, it's like the ultimate black box, right? It's non-deterministic, magical black box. So just the black box thing, right? Like, kind of basic function concepts. Like, I have an input, I put it in this black box, I get an output. And so if I do use a black box, it has to be super reasonable. So when do I need a black box? When I'm, hiding intellectual property. And oftentimes when things are really, really complex and I want to provide some simple interface for developers to use. But so then so anytime we introduce a black box, it needs to be reasonable. So what does that mean? There's a documented relationship of the inputs and the outputs. And if I get an error, I have to be able to reason about it based on what I've put in. So all of my error messaging should really focus on what likely came into my system. And then AI, the challenge is that it's not deterministic. I can put different inputs in and get different outputs, and ultimately it presents really hard challenges. So, like, when is that needed? For me, it's hard problems for humans to solve. Like inspiration, I keep coming back to just suggestions that get us kind of started is sometimes that creative blocker. Pattern recognition, humans are sort of challenged at really large-scale pattern recognition. And then mundane tasks, things that can easily be kind of sent off to something else to do that work. So what does an AI product need to be reasonable? I have no idea. Like this is all changing so quickly. But the few things that I've been kind of coming back to is like, don't presume people have strong prompt engineering skills, because prompt engineering, like I think back to early internet days before everybody got really good at searching Google, like in the Ask Jeeves days, people would ask these, long questions, like full sentence questions, and you wouldn't really get good answers back, and then everybody learns to Google well, where you just use a couple of keywords, and now we're back to really long questions, right? But now you are now going to be in the voice of, like you have to structure these crazy prompts, and it's just going to take a few years for everyone to get comfortable with that. So what do you do when you can't presume people are going to ask good questions to an AI? And then, the more we can expose about what's actually happening in the service, the better it is for a developer, at least to reason about what's happening and what might be going wrong with an AI system. So that's design for simplicity, design for exceptions. As I said earlier, like a great developer experience is often better predicted by unhappy path features. So don't over-index on your getting started experience. Like every dev tool in the world has this really awesome getting started experience where it takes 5 minutes and everything happens. But like, what happens over the lifetime of your use of that tool, and is that tool helping you be a powerful developer? And then plan for escape hatches. Like, you can have as strong an opinion as you want, but ultimately somebody is going to have some use case that doesn't match your set of opinions, so make it as frictionless as possible. And then reduce the feature learning curve. Like, let's be honest, how long does it take for you to learn XM? Like, just the core features of XM. Like, how many certification courses and how much training do we have to get to understand the core features of the product? And then what does it take to be a master, to really know all of the features of a product? Could you possibly get to a point where you could learn the core features of a product in a few hours and learn all the features in a few dedicated days? Like, that's my ambitious, call to action here, is try to reduce the feature learning curve at all costs when we introduce tooling. And then this idea that products should speak for itself. Like, I want the product to be able to stand on its own before I ever want to go to docs. But then when I want to go to docs, I want those to stand on their own before I ever have to go out to the wider community for content, before I ever have to go on Slack and ask a question. So that's sort of my ambition there. And I'm going to cough right now. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to skip through this because this is just kind of the questions that follow this notion of DevEx metrics. So we talked about feedback loops and cognitive beats and flow state. And so this presentation is available afterwards if you want to look through any of this. But these are kind of the questions defining the metrics that we're going to use. So with 20 minutes left, we get to what is Sitecore building and how are we using these principles to help define our roadmap for DevEx in XM Cloud and then in the greater Sitecore ecosystem. And then I'm going to cough again. A lot of talking. I'm going to drink some water too. Okay. So what is Sitecore building? All right, websites is like bonkers. I know I made a crazy slide. So as I said, I was dividing between front end and offering extensibility, and so I'm thinking about front end development. And so I want to think about both sides of the axes. How are we building products that focus on happy path and unhappy path? And then how are we accounting for how we plan that work and scale out to docs and content and community? So several of the topics, I think there are slides that will actually go into the individual topics, but I wanted to show this crazy town slide to just say, we're trying to think holistically. And then in authoring extensibility, the same thing, thinking holistically about these product space. So, a few things to talk about. Our framework strategy. So, we've announced recently that we're kind of expanding the frameworks that we support in XM Cloud. There's been some messaging about kind of Next.js only, and we want to update that messaging to be broadly framework agnostic. But in order to get there, we're sort of executing this two-phased approach. So first phase, we are simplifying and modernizing our front-end SDKs. And that involves these three different steps of cleaning up JSS. I know that's sort of a terrible way of saying it, but JSS is, it's actually, it's a wildly successful product, but it has some age to it, which means there was a lot of ideas in it that ended up, kind of falling to the wayside. And they add a lot of complexity and debt to maintain as we try to progress into what the front-end SDK will look like in the future. We are really focused and determined on making leaner, more modern starter kits, a starter kit that has less in it, so that you can do what you want a bit easier. I think there's a slide where I talk about this a bit more. And then we're aiming for framework and runtime agnosticism. So you will not need any specific framework in order for pages to work, in order for visual editing to work within XM Cloud. And then once we, sort of get through that phase, then we're really pushing for this expansion of starter kits and kind of broad marketplace of UI library support, and a real emphasis on open source and community contribution to building with Sitecore and with XM Cloud. So what does a framework agnostic approach to pages look like? This diagram, I was talking about this earlier with Andy, but when we were talking about the project that we call page speed optimization. So this diagram over to the right represents everything that's in the front-end web application in order to support editing with pages. And that's a lot. There's a lot of middleware, there's a whole caching layer going on, and it puts some constraints on how to build with other frameworks, with single page application frameworks that don't have backends like Angular and things of that nature. So all of this is going away. We're totally moving it all back to pages. So pages maintains its own responsibility for visual editing, and all of that complexity goes out of the front-end web application. Some other side benefits to this: it's going to make pages faster. It's going to reduce a lot of the starter kit complexity and CORS issues. There's a lot of CORS complexities that happens where you get these CORS errors. Azure, I don't know, as you've done local development, you've probably run into this in the ecosystem, and all of that kind of goes away when Pages handles its own visualization. So really excited about this. It has benefits to the end user. Pages will be faster, and it also will just greatly reduce complexity in local development. It will also have this side effect of no more ngrok or local containers or local storage overrides in order to get pages to work with your local development. You just go into Pages, point to localhost 3000, and it'll work. And so a lot of the front-end development complexity that oftentimes front-end developers who are not like Sitecore experts are challenged with, that all goes away with this work effort, which is definitely underway. We are deep in the project. So other thing, what do leaner, modern starter kits look like? As much as possible, we're moving the complexity of our build systems out of the starter kit into our SDK. And in that way, you can use it. You can use the configs, but if you want to use something else, our tools are available to you, and you can build the starter kit however you want to. And then one other thing that I want to talk about, which is why our starter kits are focused on Next.js right now. Like ultimately, if we look at what our end users need and what's going to give them the best marketing experience, I keep landing here. Like we need to move as much as possible from content to experience. And so content is static, but experiences are dynamic. And if that change is based on user information we already know, then it's something that should be generated at the server or the edge runtime. If it's based on a user action, we put it on the client. And we, especially with the use of AI, but really with all personalization, we want to be able to stream experiences. Like after you get a piece of data, it's headed out to your customer at every time. So if you look at patterns in front-end web applications that provide you with static and dynamic and server and edge and client and streaming, like you land on this pattern that is being introduced by Next.js, partial pre-rendering, but you also see it in other meta frameworks that are surfacing streaming islands. And we're making some big bets here that is the pattern that's going to stay for quite a while. And if we get there, we get to the fact that like it's Next.js is probably like ahead of everybody because they're kind of pushing these patterns. But these other meta frameworks are coming along and are just a few, probably a year out or so. And so if we want to build starter kits that are going to meet the needs of our customers broadly, we're going to try to aim to build for the 80%, but to provide pathways for those of you whose customers can't come on the Next.js journey. You've already heavily invested in Angular practice, and moving out from it is just going to be too costly, and it's going to shift too much of your internal development resources. We recognize that that also needs a pathway for support in XM Cloud. So while we're not going to be able to invest in our own starter kits for every framework or language or application paradigm, we're going to support you all. So that's why we're headed to this totally framework agnostic approach to supporting XM Cloud. So you can build on anything. And so what does that mean if you have to build a starter kit that we don't already support? We want to encourage kind of community contribution, right? Like if you've seen, there's this great community Astro framework that's cropped up that attacked a ton of really interesting features of Astro with support for XM and XM Cloud with JSS, and we want to encourage that more and more. So if you want to build a starter kit for any framework or any kind of paradigm that you're interested in building, we're going to provide some support to you, some architectural consulting. We'll give you access to our roadmap and create some dedicated communication channels to encourage that work as much as possible. And the big one is we're going to open source our .NET Core SDK. So the .NET Core SDK is not going anywhere. It's actually going to get better and better. So it's going to be open source. We're going to be welcoming contributions, but also scrutiny of how it's built. We're going to be adding some out-of-the-box personalization support to the SDK this year, so that it's as full-featured as our JSS SDK. And we'll also be introducing a .NET Core editing host into deploy, so that a .NET Core runtime for web applications is much of a first-class citizen in deploy as a JavaScript-based one. And with this new kind of framework agnostic approach, it's totally possible to build in Blazor if you want, because you don't actually need any specific UI framework in order for pages to work. So, and then just one kind of note, we recognize that right now we have kind of 3 different competing component systems within the XM Cloud ecosystem. We have our F6A components, our traditional headless components. We have our front-end as a service and the component builder, and then we have BYOC, which is kind of a code-based approach that works with our front-end as a service components. And so we recognize that we don't want to be introducing this many patterns. So, our roadmap of the future is really like a best of both worlds approach. It's kind of blending these 2 competing code-based component approaches, and then leaning into when you want low-code components, when a marketer really needs to be empowered to just work on their own and get things out without the need of a developer. So I think there's some really interesting work going on in this space, but we are still a bit out from good announcements here, but I'm really excited about where we're headed. All right, now I'll just briefly talk about authoring extensibility. Okay, 8 minutes left. Wow, cool. I'm doing good on time. Okay, so authoring extensibility. Look, I want to recognize a few things when it comes to XM Cloud. The position, the product and architectural position has been customize the CM as little as possible, no customizations. Do all of that work in the head application, because as much as possible, you are going to be better served by a SaaS product by not customizing it. However, that means we need to be introducing really good extensible patterns that are fit for purpose for a SaaS world. We cannot acknowledge the fact that you're solving problems by working in the CM, by extending it, by adding custom content resolution, by building your own integrations and your own applications in the CM. And in XM Cloud, we want to introduce different patterns, but we need to offer those to you. So as Roger had mentioned, yesterday, we're really kind of focused on this marketplace of authoring extensibility patterns that will allow you to build apps and plugins and all sorts of patterns fit for purpose for a solid SaaS product. So the big ones that I kind of keep landing around is custom content resolution. How do we introduce new patterns where you're not writing resolution to the layout service from the authoring side? So we've got some great ideas there. Also, if we're going to say, build your own custom apps to integrate with the CM, we need to surface really solid authoring and management APIs and a good SDK. And so we're doing work there to really invest in great new APIs for sites, pages, components, and items, and a solid SDK to provide utilities around any kind of common work against those APIs. Non-visual content pages. So one of the sort of common questions is, what's the equivalent to an edit frame within pages? And so we've got a lot of plans on the horizon to solve some of that with a data view, but also introducing a UI plugin system and introducing new kind of field level data binding patterns so that you can bring in external data sources in really interesting, more complicated ways. And then, as I mentioned, the application marketplace, a place for you to be able to introduce all sorts of third-party integrations that aren't available in XM Cloud, and the ability to build your own and offer it to your customers. Briefly, I just want to touch on the kind of radiating circles. So that's product. What are we doing in docs? So, as a basic principle, we want to invest in the notion that documentation is a DevEx product. And that means that developer docs need to be fit for purpose for developers. So we're underway updating the information architecture of our developer docs to really focus on the features and this orientation of, there's XM Cloud, there's building with XM Cloud, that means front end and offering extensibility. And then let's see, content. I'd say the Accelerate program, if any of you have been building with XM Cloud and you've not gone to see the Sitecore Accelerate recipes for XM Cloud, they're amazing. They have gotten so robust, and they really are a center focus of best practices for building with XM Cloud, and that sort of mindset of good recipes and great sets of best practices to encourage the best patterns possible in the community, something we're serious about investing in. And then community. I want to say this investment in open source from R&D, we're serious about it. We have support engineers who are going to be dedicated to issue triage within our SDK GitHub repositories. We're going to have discussion moderators. We're going to focus on monthly meetups. We're going to be transparent in the roadmap on those products. This isn't, open sourcing something to let it go to die. This is open sourcing it to invest more in open, transparent usage of our developer tooling. And as I mentioned earlier in the heart-to-heart talk, we recognize that for a lot of our customers, including our own, developers inside of Sitecore, reskilling is sometimes a thing we need to do, right? We have a tradition of .NET Core, and now we're asking our customers to learn Next.js, to learn, React, and learn GraphQL, and so we're not going to be at Sitecore the experts in modern web development practices, but front-end masters is, and so we've partnered with them to create these UI pathways and this integration pathway to have a good starting point of suggested courses in order to upskill on best modern front-end web development practices. So right now, we're doing a beta test of this internally with our own teams, and then a small beta test of MVPs and customers. And if it's successful, hopefully we'll scale it out to anybody who wants to join. And so that's it. That's everything I'm thinking about with regards to developer experience in XM Cloud and in Sitecore. I'd love to, talk to you about it, whatever it is you're interested in, and thank you. Okay, questions?
So right now we are using Sitecore XP 10 series, which is running on the .NET Framework 4.8. But Microsoft already announced that they are shifting their whole development on the .NET Core, and for the .NET Framework, they don't have any future plan. But Sitecore is developed on the top of the .NET Framework, so don't you think that there is a risk here for the Sitecore product itself and for all the products which are running on the .NET Framework?
Absolutely. Yeah. How to approach that is the question we're addressing now. Is it to rebuild a .NET Core? Is it to break out service by service into many .NET Core applications? So we're absolutely we have a roadmap in place to address this. It's just rebuilding everything in .NET Core as one single platform still creates just as many platform problems. It just builds faster. So, like how do we look at our technology and decide, I don't know, structure by structure, what needs to be kind of decomposed into many microservices. So, I mean, we're already taking microservices outside of the XM product and putting them in XM Cloud into separate microservices. So, decomposing the platform into a SaaS solution is already deeply practice we're working through right now in XM Cloud.
Yeah, but maybe after 3 years, right now for the .NET framework, Microsoft announced that there is a long-term support is going to be there, but not all the clients are going to be migrated on the XM Cloud.
Oh, but I'm the product lead of XM Cloud, so that's the only thing I'm talking about today. Yeah.
Hi, Lisa. Yeah, thank you for your good session, good visibility for your future of what we can expect and what we can support from our as well community level. So I just saw that some details were explaining the cleaning up of JSS to maybe some of the services from the JSS certificate to the pages. So in this stage, okay, the experience editor also is supporting this, what you see, what you get experience. So are you planning, or Sitecore is planning to sunset of experience editor options? Because pages also, you are showing one of the slide also on the front end, the pages also you can directly connect without local storage and local container. So this points is correlate to, I think, so experience editor going forward is will get sunset soon.
Absolutely. So two things. The plan has always been in XM Cloud that Pages is a replacement for Experience Editor. They are not two things that are going to live side by side for very long. It was a matter of just kind of building up to feature parity in the way that we feel is more modern for Pages. So absolutely, if you're building an XM Cloud, you should be building towards Pages and what Pages has available, and not to every feature and pattern that exists in Experience Editor. That is very true. So with regards to this simplification, in order to use it, you're right, it will mean sunsetting Experience Editor for that customer. The reason is because Experience Editor doesn't auto-save. So we've been talking with the XP product team saying like, hey, if you want to build, auto-save into Experience Editor, we can certainly backport all the work that we're doing in JSS. So I think the plan is essentially for us to just kind of move forward with what's best for XM Cloud, but always create a channel back that when and if the platform team feels that it's a good fit to go and build autosave, they'll be able to come right along with us.
So if you are planning to sunset Experience Editor, then the pages options will come out of the box
yes.
featured in the XP and XM in future?
So yes, I think we are strategically waiting until we have data management within Pages to sunset Experience Editor, like edit frames as we've seen it, and a couple of field options within Pages have been the kind of bigger gating principles. So as long as we can sort of add those and suggest new patterns, we'll feel comfortable at that point sunsetting Experience Editor.
Okay, and next final question.
Oh yeah, only in XM Cloud. Pages is replacement for Experience Editor in XM Cloud. We're not talking about sunsetting Experience Editor in the platform because it is your only visual editing editor. Other questions? Cool. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.